There are rituals we're taught to perform when someone dies. Light the candles, say the prayers, scatter the ashes, close the doors. We're told these rituals bring peace to the departed, that they guide souls toward whatever waits beyond. But what they don't tell you, what they can't tell you, is that sometimes the departed don't want peace. Sometimes love itself becomes the cage that traps a soul between worlds, and when that happens, the rituals we perform aren't protection at all. They're invitations. This is the story of what happens when grief refuses to let go, when the boundary between devotion and obsession dissolves entirely, and when the dead decide that death itself is negotiable. It's about three people bound by choices made in moments of weakness, by promises spoken and unspoken, and by a love that couldn't distinguish between sacrifice and destruction. What you're about to hear isn't just a ghost story. It's a case study in how the human heart, in its desperate need to hold on, can create monsters far more terrifying than any legend. Let me start with the funeral, because that's where everything truly began, though none of them knew it yet. The cremation ground sat at the edge of town, where the forest pressed close and the air always carried the scent of smoke and something older, something that predated the town itself. The body lay prepared on the pyre, wrapped in red fabric as tradition demanded. Red for married women, red for those who left behind a husband, red for those whose stories weren't finished. Her eyes were open. That detail matters. The priest tried 3 times to close them, his fingers trembling as he whispered prayers under his breath. But each time those lids slid back open, revealing eyes that seemed to stare at something just beyond the visible world. The gathered mourners shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered that open eyes meant unfinished business. Someone else said it meant the spirit was confused, unable to find its path forward. Nobody said what they were all thinking, that those eyes looked aware, that they seemed to be watching, waiting, measuring. The husband, let's call him Aditya because that's who he was before everything changed, stood closest to the pyre. His face was a mask, completely blank, as if his mind had simply stopped processing what was happening. He'd loved her, everyone knew that. Their marriage had been brief but genuine, built on late-night conversations and shared silences, on the kind of comfortable intimacy that some people search for their entire lives. And then one night, without warning, her heart simply stopped. No illness, no accident, just a sudden, inexplicable failure of the organ that had loved him so completely. The priest lit the fire. The flames caught quickly, too quickly, consuming the oil-soaked wood with an eager hunger. But as the fire grew, something strange happened. The body didn't burn. The flames danced around it, creating patterns in the air, filling the space with heat and light and choking smoke, but the flesh remained stubbornly intact. The priest added more wood. The flames rose higher. Still, the body resisted, as if some fundamental law of physics had decided to take a holiday. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the smoke golden, and still the cremation wouldn't complete. The mourners began to leave, uncomfortable with the violation of natural order they were witnessing. By the time the pyre finally collapsed into ash and bone, only a handful of people remained. One of them was Shruti, the dead woman's younger sister. She'd stood apart from the others throughout the ceremony, her face unreadable, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. When Aditya finally turned to leave, she caught his arm. "You loved my sister," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, unable to speak. "Then promise me something. Promise me you won't forget her. Promise me you won't let her go." He should have understood what she was really asking. He should have heard the desperation beneath those words, the guilt, the complex knot of emotions that comes from surviving when someone you love doesn't. But grief makes us stupid, makes us agree to things we don't understand, so he simply nodded again and walked away, not knowing he'd just sealed a contract with forces that don't care about human intentions. That night, he returned to the house they'd shared. It felt wrong immediately. The way a familiar room feels wrong when you walk into it in complete darkness and can't quite remember where the furniture is. Everything was exactly where it should be, but the spaces between objects felt charged with possibility, with presence. He moved through the rooms mechanically, checking locks, turning off lights, performing the small rituals of ending a day even though the day would never truly end. It was 2 in the morning when thirst dragged him from the bed he couldn't sleep in anyway. He didn't turn on the kitchen light. The moon was bright enough to navigate by, and something in him wanted the darkness, needed it as a kind of camouflage. He was reaching for a glass when he saw her. She stood by the sink, her back to him, wearing the same red fabric she'd been cremated in. Her hair hung loose down her back, and her head was tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. He froze. His rational mind, the part that still functioned, tried to construct explanations. A trick of moonlight and shadow. A hallucination born from exhaustion and trauma. A waking dream. But then she turned, and he saw her face, and all those careful explanations evaporated like water on hot stone. It was her. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, not some translucent, ethereal thing. She looked solid, real, exactly as she had in life except for the eyes. Those were different. They held an intensity that living eyes couldn't sustain, a focused hunger that made his skin prickle with instinctive alarm. She smiled, and it was the smile he remembered, the one that had made him fall in love. But it was also wrong somehow, like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed, all the details correct but the fundamental essence off. He tried to say her name, but his throat had closed. She took a step toward him, and he stumbled backward, his hip hitting the counter hard enough to bruise. She stopped, and for a moment something like hurt flickered across her features. Then she was gone, simply absent, as if she'd never been there at all. He stood in the dark kitchen for a long time after that, his heart hammering, his mind trying desperately to categorize what had just happened into something manageable, something that fit within the rules of the world he thought he understood. He didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. Instead, he sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the shadows for movement, listening for footsteps that never quite came. During the day, he functioned on autopilot, going through the motions of work and normalcy while his mind circled obsessively around those few seconds in the kitchen. Had she really been there? Was he losing his grip on reality? And underneath those questions, a deeper, more troubling one, if she was there, if she'd somehow remained, what did she want? That's when Shruti started visiting. At first, it seemed natural enough. She was grieving too, after all. She brought food, straightened the house, sat with him in companionable silence. Her presence was comforting in its ordinariness, a reminder that the world still contained normal things, normal people, normal interactions. He found himself looking forward to her visits, found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected, sharing memories of her sister, talking about the future he'd lost. What he didn't notice, what he couldn't have noticed because the change was so gradual, was that Shruti was transforming. It started with small things. She began wearing her hair the way her sister had. She started using the same perfume, a distinctive scent that brought memories flooding back every time she entered a room. She adopted certain phrases, certain gestures, certain ways of tilting her head that were eerily familiar. It was as if, piece by piece, she was reconstructing the person who died, using herself as the raw material. The families noticed the growing bond between them. They began to talk, the way families do, about how natural it would be, how right. After all, Aditya was alone now. Shruti was unmarried. There had even been discussion, years ago, about a match between them before Aditya had met her sister. Perhaps fate was simply correcting itself, bringing together two people who were meant to be. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a pressure that neither Aditya nor Shruti knew how to resist. But someone else was listening to those whispers. someone who existed in the spaces between seen and unseen, who watched through windows that only opened inward, who felt every moment of growing closeness as a betrayal so profound it transcended the boundary between life and death. The dead woman, whose name we'll call Sanjana because names have power and this one carried the weight of unfulfilled love, had never left. She'd been there all along, observing, waiting, her presence growing stronger as her rage and grief fed on themselves in an endless cycle. Strange things began happening in the house. Objects would move during the night. Aditya would come home to find tea prepared and sitting on the counter, still warm, though nobody had been there. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, and he'd feel the weight of invisible eyes tracking his every movement. Once he came home early and heard voices from the bedroom. When he rushed in, terrified and ready to confront an intruder, he found the room empty except for the unmistakable scent of Sanjana's perfume hanging thick in the air. The manifestations intensified. He'd wake in the night feeling pressure on his chest, as if someone were sitting on him, and he'd open his eyes to see her face hovering inches from his, her expression unreadable in the darkness. He'd glimpse her in mirrors, standing behind him, her lips moving in words he couldn't hear. She appeared at the edges of his vision constantly now, a red figure that vanished the moment he turned to look directly. Neighbors started talking. They'd seen a woman in red walking the lanes at night, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. She'd stand outside Aditya's house for hours, unmoving, her face tilted up toward the windows. When anyone approached her, she'd simply disappear, leaving behind only the faint sound of anklet bells ringing in the empty air. The stories spread. People began avoiding the street after dark. Parents called their children inside earlier. The town's collective unconscious recognized what was happening even if no one wanted to speak it aloud, that death had occurred but departure hadn't, that something was trapped in the in-between space, and it was growing more powerful, more desperate, more dangerous. Then came the night when Shruti stayed over. It had gotten late, they'd been talking, and the idea of her walking home alone in the dark seemed wrong somehow. So she called her family, and she stayed, and that's when things truly shifted. That's when the haunting stopped being passive and became active, when observation became interference, when the dead decided that watching was no longer enough. Shruti fell asleep on the couch. Aditya retreated to the bedroom, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay in the darkness, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the quality of silence. Around midnight, he heard movement from the living room, footsteps soft and careful. He told himself it was Shruti, getting water or checking the locks. But something in the rhythm of those steps was wrong. They were too measured, too purposeful. They were the steps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they got there. He got up, moved silently down the hallway, and stopped at the doorway to the living room. What he saw there would have broken him if he'd had any sanity left to break. Shruti was still asleep on the couch, her breathing deep and even. But standing over her, visible in the moonlight streaming through the window, was Sanjana. She wasn't looking at Aditya. Her attention was completely focused on her sister, and the expression on her face was complex beyond description. Love and hatred, jealousy and compassion, recognition and absolute incomprehension. She reached out one hand, hovering it just above Shruti's forehead, and Aditya understood with sudden, terrible clarity what he was witnessing. This wasn't a haunting. It was a merger. It was possession in the most literal sense. The air in the room grew thick, resistant, like trying to move through water. Sanjana's form began to blur, becoming less solid, more like smoke. And as she became less substantial, Shruti began to change. Her features shifted subtly, her expression rearranging itself into something that wasn't quite her own. The transfer was happening slowly, incrementally, but it was happening. The dead woman was finding a way back into the world of the living, and she was using her own sister's body as the vessel. Aditya must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp of horror, because Sanjana's head snapped toward him. For one endless moment, they stared at each other across the dark room. Then she smiled, and it was the most terrible thing he'd ever seen, because it was genuinely happy. She was happy. This was what she wanted, what she'd been working toward all along. She was coming back, and nothing, not death itself, was going to stop her. The next morning, Shruti woke with no memory of the night. But Aditya noticed the changes immediately. The way she moved was different. Her voice had a different quality, a slight shift in pitch and rhythm. She made tea the way Sanjana had made it, using a method Shruti had never known. When Aditya mentioned a specific memory, something only he and Sanjana had shared, Shruti responded with details she shouldn't have possessed, then looked confused when he pressed her on how she knew them. It happened again and again over the following days. Shruti would do something, say something, react to something in a way that was purely Sanjana, then return to being herself without any awareness of the transition. It was as if two consciousnesses were occupying the same space, taking turns at the controls, though only one of them knew the sharing was happening. Aditya watched in growing horror as the woman he'd begun to care for was slowly erased, overwritten by the ghost of the woman he'd loved. The families, oblivious to what was really happening, accelerated their plans. They formalized the engagement. They set a wedding date. Every obstacle that arose, and there were many, seemed designed by some malevolent force determined to see this union happen. The printer caught fire while making invitations. The priest fell mysteriously ill. The ceremony had to be rescheduled 3 times. But eventually, despite everything, the wedding day arrived. Aditya went through the rituals in a daze. As he took Shruti's hand to lead her around the sacred fire, her skin felt wrong, too cold, like touching something that had been in a refrigerator. When she looked up at him, her eyes held that same intense, hungry quality he'd seen in the kitchen that first night. She smiled, and he absolutely knew, that the person he was marrying wasn't really Shruti at all. But what could he do? The families were watching. The priest was chanting. The moment had its own momentum, carrying him along whether he wanted to go or not. The first weeks of marriage were a special kind of hell. Shruti, or the thing that wore Shruti's face, was attentive and loving in ways that mimicked a normal newlywed. But nothing felt right. She prepared meals exactly the way Sanjana had prepared them. She arranged the furniture to match Sanjana's preferences. She wore Sanjana's clothes, even though they'd been packed away. It was as if Sanjana was using her sister's body to recreate the marriage she'd lost, to force reality into the shape it should have been if death hadn't interrupted. But the worst part, the part that kept Aditya awake night after night, was that Shruti was still in there somewhere. He could see it in moments of confusion that crossed her face, in the way she'd sometimes start to say something and then stop, looking lost. The real Shruti was trapped inside her own body, a prisoner watching as something else piloted her through days she had no control over. And she was aware enough to be terrified, though not aware enough to understand why. Then came the night when everything escalated. Aditya woke to find Shruti, or rather Sanjana, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at him. The moonlight caught her face, and there was no ambiguity anymore. This wasn't a blending or a sharing. This was complete occupation. Sanjana was fully in control, and she wanted him to know it. "I never left," she said, and her voice was wrong, layered, as if two people were speaking simultaneously. "I told you death wouldn't separate us. I meant it." He tried to respond, but fear had locked his vocal cords. "She's still here, you know," Sanjana continued, gesturing at her stolen body. "She feels everything. Every touch, every word, every moment. She's screaming, but no one can hear her except me, and I find it soothing, like rain on a roof. Do you want to know what it's like, being her? Being trapped in your own flesh while someone else makes it dance?" "Stop," he finally managed. "Please stop." But Sanjana was just getting started. This was her moment, the culmination of everything she'd worked toward. She leaned closer, and he could smell death on her breath despite the living body she wore. "You're mine," she said. "You were always mine, and now I have what I need to keep you forever." She placed one hand on her stomach, a gesture loaded with meaning. "This child will be ours, not hers. Mine, the ultimate binding. You, me, and a piece of both of us that can never be undone." Aditya felt reality tilt. The pregnancy had been confirmed just days before, and he'd been trying to feel joy about it, trying to connect to the idea of fatherhood. But now the truth hit him like a physical blow. Whatever was growing inside Shruti's body, it wasn't a normal child. It was something else, something born from a union that should never have happened, a fusion of living and dead that violated every natural law. The demands started that same night. Sanjana, speaking through Shruti's mouth, began making requests that grew progressively stranger and more disturbing. She wanted specific rituals performed, objects retrieved from impossible places, acts completed that felt more like occult ceremonies than anything else. And she made it clear that refusal wasn't an option. If Aditya didn't comply, she'd hurt Shruti. She'd twist the pregnancy into something monstrous. She'd make sure everyone involved suffered in ways that would make death look merciful by comparison. So he complied. What choice did he have? He gathered sacred oil and let it burn for 7 nights. He stole a statue from an abandoned temple. He performed rituals that left him feeling soiled, as if he'd stained himself with something that could never be washed away. Each demand was worse than the last. Each compliance took him deeper into a world where normal rules no longer applied. Until the night she asked for a sacrifice. Not an animal. Not something symbolic. A human life. She was specific about it, detailed in her requirements. The victim had to be willing, had to offer themselves freely, had to understand what their death would accomplish. Only then would Sanjana release her hold on Shruti. Only then would the nightmare end. Aditya realized, in that moment, that he'd reached a boundary he couldn't cross. Whatever else he'd done, whatever compromises he'd made, he couldn't murder for her. He couldn't give her what she was asking. And in refusing, he understood that he'd need help, real help, from someone who understood what he was dealing with. That's what brought him to the ashram on the mountain. The holy man who lived there, Baba Sudarshanath, had a reputation. People spoke of him in whispers, trading stories about hauntings he'd ended, possessions he'd broken, spirits he'd freed. The path to his dwelling was steep and treacherous, and Aditya made the climb with a sense of grim purpose, knowing this was his last chance, his final option before everything collapsed completely. The Baba listened to the entire story without interruption. When Aditya finished, the old man sat silent for a long time, his eyes closed, his breathing so slow it seemed he might have fallen asleep. Then he opened his eyes, and Aditya saw knowledge there, understanding so deep it was frightening. Love that refuses to end becomes its own kind of death, the Baba said. Your wife loved you so completely that she couldn't let go. That kind of attachment is poison to a soul. It traps them between worlds, and they become something other than what they were, something that knows only hunger and need and the desperate requirement to hold on. What you're facing isn't evil in the traditional sense. It's grief transformed into something that resembles evil because it's forgotten how to be anything else. Can you help? Aditya asked, and he heard the desperation in his own voice. The Baba was quiet for another long moment. Then, I can try, but you need to understand the risk. What you're asking me to do is sever a bond that exists beyond death. That kind of severance has consequences. It could kill the host body. It could damage both souls permanently. It could fail entirely, and if it fails, the entity will become more powerful than before, more angry, more dangerous. Are you prepared for those possibilities? Aditya thought of Shruti, trapped inside her own body. He thought of the unborn child, whatever it was becoming. He thought of Sanjana, consumed by an obsession that had transformed her from the woman he'd loved into something he could barely recognize. And he nodded, because what else could he do? The barber gave him a list. Items to gather, each one symbolic, each one necessary for the ritual he'd perform. Ash from the cremation ground, collected on a moonless night. A branch from a specific tree, cut with a specific prayer. Black sesame seeds and mustard oil. A red thread that had been worn by a widow. And finally, a handful of earth from the exact spot where Sanjana's body had been burned. Without these components, the ritual would fail, and failure would mean something worse than death for everyone involved. It took Aditya 2 days to gather everything. The entire time, he felt watched. Shadows moved at the corners of his vision. Wind rose at moments that should have been still. Objects fell from shelves for no reason. Sanjana knew what he was planning, and she was trying to stop him, using every bit of influence she'd accumulated to interfere. But he persisted, driven by a determination born from sheer desperation. The night of the ritual arrived. The barber came to the house as the sun set, carrying a bag of tools and herbs, his face set in grim concentration. They prepared the living room, drawing a circle with sacred powder, placing lamps at the cardinal directions, arranging the gathered items in a specific pattern. Shruti was brought to the center, confusion and fear warring on her face. She didn't understand what was happening, but some part of her, the part that was still herself, sensed that this was important, that her fate hung on what happened in the next few hours. The barber began chanting. The words were older than the language Aditya spoke, carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the room. The air grew thick and heavy. The flames of the lamps bent in directions that had nothing to do with any physical wind. And Shruti began to change. Her face twisted, cycling through expressions that weren't her own. Her voice emerged as a scream that sounded like multiple people screaming simultaneously. "You can't take this from me," Sanjana howled through Shruti's mouth. "I earned this. I suffered. I died for him. This is mine by right of pain and sacrifice. You have no authority here." The barber didn't pause in his chanting. He sprinkled the cremation ground ash around Shruti in a protective circle, then took the tree branch and used it to mark symbols in the air, invisible lines that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Shruti's body began to convulse, her back arching, her fingers clawing at the ground. Something was being torn loose, something that had rooted itself deep and was fighting with everything it had to remain anchored. "If I can't have him, no one can," Sanjana's voice promised, and there was such rage in those words that Aditya felt his blood freeze. "I'll destroy her. I'll destroy the child. I'll destroy everything before I'll let go." The barber finally spoke directly to the entity. "Your time in this world ended when your body burned. What you're doing now is a violation of the order that keeps worlds separate. You must release this vessel. You must return to where you belong. Love isn't enough reason to break reality. Love is the only reason that matters," Sanjana shot back. "And I loved more completely than either of them ever could. My love was pure, total, absolute. They could never match it." The argument revealed something crucial, something Aditya hadn't fully understood until that moment. Sanjana's possession wasn't just about reclaiming what she'd lost. It was about proving something. She needed to demonstrate that her love was superior, that it transcended every boundary, even death itself. She needed to win, and winning meant consuming everyone in her path. The barber threw the earth from the cremation site into the ritual fire. As it hit the flames, a sound emerged that wasn't quite sound, more like pressure against the eardrums, a vibration that rattled teeth and made the floor seem to ripple. Shruti screamed again, but this time it was clearly her voice, not Sanjana's, a sound of pure agony as something was ripped away from her core. Black smoke began pouring from Shruti's mouth, thick and oily, forming a cloud above her head that twisted and writhed like something alive. In that smoke, just for a moment, Aditya saw a face. Sanjana's face, but transformed, twisted by rage and grief into something barely human. She looked at him one final time, and in that look was every possible emotion, love and hate so tangled together they'd become indistinguishable. Then the smoke was sucked into the flames, consumed by the sacred fire, and the ritual circle exploded with light bright enough to temporarily blind. When vision returned, Shruti was collapsed on the floor, unconscious but breathing. The heavy pressure that had filled the room was gone. The air felt normal again, just air, nothing more. The barber slumped against the wall, exhausted, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool night. "It's done," he said. But then he added, "Remember what I told you. Some attachments are too strong to fully sever. I've broken her hold on this world, but the connection still exists. It's dormant now, but under the right conditions, it could activate again. You need to be careful. All of you need to be very careful." Shruti woke hours later with no memory of the possession. When Aditya explained what had happened, she went pale, then started crying, deep sobs that shook her entire body. The idea that her sister, her beloved sister, had been using her, violating her in such an intimate way, was almost too much to process. She felt betrayed by everyone, including herself, for not being strong enough to fight back, even though fighting had never been an option. The families learned the truth. Reactions ranged from disbelief to horror to a kind of resigned acceptance. "These things happen sometimes," the elderly whispered. "Love that doesn't know when to end. Grief that becomes malevolent. Spirits that refuse the next stage. There are old remedies, old protections, old prayers meant to guard against such occurrences. But knowledge doesn't always help. Understanding doesn't always prevent." They made decisions. The house would be abandoned, left empty, sealed against future occupants. Too much had happened there, too many moments of horror that had soaked into the walls and floor. Shruti and Aditya would move far away, start over in a place with no memories, no ghosts, no connections to what had been. The pregnancy would be monitored carefully, watched for any sign that whatever had been growing inside Shruti during the possession had left permanent marks. But they all knew, though nobody said it aloud, that you can't really run from something like this. Sanjana's attachment hadn't been to a place. It had been to a person, to Aditya specifically, and that kind of connection doesn't acknowledge distance or time. She was out there somewhere, in whatever realm holds spirits that refuse to complete their journey. She was waiting, patient now because she'd learned patience, watching for any crack in the defenses the ritual had erected. She'd proven she could break through barriers between worlds. What was to stop her from doing it again? The child was born 6 months later. A girl, healthy by all physical measures. But Aditya sometimes catches her staring at nothing with an intensity that reminds him of someone else. She has nightmares about people she's never met. She draws pictures of events that happened before she was born, and occasionally, very occasionally, she speaks in a voice that isn't quite her own, using turns of phrase that a child her age shouldn't know. Shruti sees it too, though she tries to pretend otherwise. They've decorated the child's room with protective symbols. They have a priest visit regularly to perform blessings. They've done everything traditional wisdom recommends for warding off unwanted spiritual influences. But both of them lie awake at night sometimes, listening to the silence, wondering if the silence is really as empty as it sounds, or if something is there, just beyond perception, biding its time. Because that's the thing about possession, about hauntings, about spirits that refuse to move on. The first incident is never the last. The first breaking of boundaries makes subsequent breaches easier. Reality has a memory, and once you've shown it can be torn, the tear becomes a weak point, a place where the fabric is forever thinner than it should be. Sanjana demonstrated that death isn't necessarily an ending, that will and desire can override fundamental laws if they're strong enough. And having proven that once, what's to prevent her from proving it again? Aditya thinks about her more than he wants to admit. He wonders where she is now, if consciousness persists in whatever space holds disembodied souls. He wonders if she's still angry, still obsessed, still convinced that her love gives her rights that supersede everyone else's autonomy. He wonders if she watches him, if she knows about his new life, his daughter, his attempts to build something normal from the wreckage of what happened. And most of all, he wonders what she's planning, because he can't shake the certainty that she's planning something, that her absence is strategic rather than permanent. Sometimes, late at night, he thinks he hears anklet bells, that distinctive sound that had heralded her manifestations during the worst of the haunting. He'll sit up in bed, straining to listen, but the sound never repeats. Sometimes he catches a scent, her perfume, in rooms where it shouldn't be. Sometimes he sees movement in mirrors, a flash of red fabric disappearing just as he turns to look. These could all be paranoia, residual trauma manifesting as sensory hallucinations. Or they could be exactly what they seem to be, signs that the barrier between worlds remains thinner than it should be, that Sanjana's presence is never quite as far away as he'd like to believe. The barber's final warning haunts him. Not the warning about the ritual's dangers, but the deeper truth buried in his words. Some attachments are too strong to fully sever. The connection still exists. It's dormant, but it could activate again. That implies agency. It implies that the connection isn't just an abstract thing but something with potential energy, something waiting for the right trigger to spring back into full force. And if it does activate, if Sanjana finds another way through, what will stop her? The ritual barely worked the first time. Would it work again? Or has she learned from her defeat, adapted, found methods that the old prayers and ceremonies can't counter? These are questions without answers, problems without solutions. All Aditya can do is maintain vigilance, watch for warning signs, and hope that hope itself isn't a trap designed to lure him into complacency. He's learned that reality is more flexible than he believed, that the rules he thought governed existence are actually more like guidelines, easily broken by sufficiently powerful will. He's learned that love, unchecked and unbalanced, can become indistinguishable from hatred. He's learned that death is a transition rather than an ending, and some people refuse to transition no matter what natural law dictates. But perhaps the most disturbing thing he's learned is that possession isn't always obvious. It doesn't always announce itself with dramatic manifestations and supernatural pyrotechnics. Sometimes it's subtle, a slow wearing away of boundaries, a gradual erosion of identity until you can't quite tell where one person ends and another begins. Shruti still has moments, even now, where her expressions shift into something familiar, where her voice takes on rhythms that belong to someone else. They pass quickly, these moments, and she never seems aware of them, but Aditya notices. He always notices. And he wonders if the ritual really expelled Sanjana completely, or if it only pushed her deeper down into some layer of consciousness where she waits, patient and implacable, for her moment to resurface. The worst part is living with uncertainty. If Sanjana had been definitively banished, if there was absolute proof that the threat had ended, he could process the trauma and move on. If she was definitely still present, he could fight, could take action, could do something. But this middle ground, this state of perpetual maybe, is its own special torture. Every unexplained event could be her. Every coincidence could be orchestrated. Every moment of peace could be the calm before devastation. How do you live a normal life when normalcy itself feels like a lie you're telling yourself to stay sane? The answer, as far as Aditya has found one, is that you don't. You can't return to normal after something like this. Normal is permanently broken, shattered into pieces that don't quite fit back together. What you can do is build something new, a life that acknowledges the trauma rather than denying it, that makes room for the fear rather than pretending bravery. You can love the people who remain while accepting that love itself has been revealed as something more complicated and more dangerous than you ever imagined. Shruti has her own relationship with what happened. She carries the knowledge that her body was violated in the most profound way possible, used as a vehicle for someone else's desires and obsessions. She feels guilt, though rationally she knows none of it was her fault. She feels grief for her sister, complicated by horror at what her sister became. She feels protective of her daughter, but also afraid of her, afraid of what might be hiding inside that small, innocent form. These contradictions tear at her constantly, creating a psychological tension that no therapy, no matter how skilled the therapist, seems able to fully address. And the daughter, the unnamed child born from a union that should never have happened, she's perhaps the biggest mystery of all. She seems normal in most ways. She laughs, she plays, she learns at the expected pace. But there are moments, small windows into something else, when her eyes go distant and she talks about things she shouldn't know. She describes rooms in the old house even though she's never been there. She mentions events from before her birth with disturbing accuracy. Once, when she was barely 3 years old, she looked at a photograph of Sanjana and said, "That's me before." When pressed, she couldn't explain what she meant, didn't even remember saying it. But Aditya and Shruti remember. They'll never forget. There's a theory in folklore about reincarnation, about souls that don't complete their journey and instead attach themselves to new life, riding along like passengers. There's another theory about spiritual inheritance, about how intense experiences can leave impressions that get passed down through bloodlines. And there's a darker theory, one nobody likes to speak aloud, about parasitic spirits that use birth as an opportunity to re-enter the world, hiding inside a new body until they're strong enough to take control. Which of these, if any, explains the girl's strange moments? Does it matter? The theories don't change the reality. They don't protect her or prepare her for whatever might be coming. Aditya documents everything. He keeps a journal, pages and pages of observations, noting every incident that seems off, every time the girl says something unsettling, every moment when she seems to be someone other than herself. He's not sure what he's trying to accomplish with this record. Perhaps he's building evidence, proof that something unnatural persists. Perhaps he's trying to identify patterns, hoping that understanding will suggest solutions. Or perhaps he's simply trying to maintain his own sanity, creating an external memory because his internal memory has become unreliable, contaminated by trauma and fear. The journal contains other entries too. Dreams that feel too vivid to be merely dreams. Moments when he's certain someone is watching him, even though he's alone. Days when the world feels slightly wrong, as if reality has shifted imperceptibly from its proper track. He doesn't share these entries with Shruti. She has enough burden to carry, but he wonders sometimes if she's experiencing the same things and simply not mentioning them for the same reason he doesn't mention them to her. They orbit each other carefully now, their relationship defined as much by what they don't say as what they do. The families have stopped asking questions. They accepted the official story that stress and grief caused temporary psychological disturbances, that medical intervention helped, that everyone is fine now. This willful blindness is both frustrating and understandable. People need to believe that the world makes sense, that horror is temporary, that proper procedures restore proper order. The alternative, accepting that some threats can't be neutralized, some dangers persist indefinitely, some violations of natural law remain violations forever, that's too destabilizing for most minds to accommodate. But Aditya can't afford that kind of blindness. His vigilance might be the only thing standing between his family and disaster. So he watches. He listens. He pays attention to details others dismiss. When the girl wakes from nightmares, he doesn't just comfort her and send her back to sleep. He asks questions, gentle but persistent, trying to understand what she saw, what she felt, whether the nightmare came from her own mind or somewhere else. When objects move or fall without obvious cause, he doesn't write it off as coincidence. He notes the location, the time, the circumstances, looking for patterns that might predict future occurrences. This level of constant alertness is exhausting. It's also probably unsustainable. He can feel himself fraying at the edges, his ability to distinguish between genuine threats and paranoid projections eroding with each sleepless night. But what choice does he have? Relaxing his guard might mean missing crucial warning signs. Trusting that everything is fine might mean walking blindly into catastrophe. The price of safety, or what passes for safety, is eternal vigilance. And he's prepared to pay that price, however much it costs him, because the alternative is unthinkable. Years pass. The girl grows. The incidents, the strange moments, they don't increase in frequency, but they don't decrease either. They persist at a steady low-level background radiation of wrongness that never quite resolves into something identifiable. Maybe this is how it will always be. Maybe there's no resolution coming, no final confrontation where things get settled once and for all. Maybe this ambiguous state of perpetual uncertainty is the permanent condition, the price of surviving what happened. Aditya has stopped looking for closure. Closure implies an ending, and he no longer believes endings are possible. Not really. Events create ripples that spread indefinitely. Actions have consequences that echo through time. Love that's strong, that total, that absolute. It doesn't just evaporate because someone performed a ritual. It transforms, it adapts, it finds new forms of expression. Sanjana's love, or what her love became, is still out there somewhere, still real, still dangerous. The ritual might have severed her direct connection to Shruti, but connection isn't the same as intention. Her intention persists, and intention is the most powerful force in any universe, material or spiritual. Sometimes he wonders what would have happened if he'd made different choices. If he'd refused to marry Shruti in the first place, recognizing the danger. If he'd been honest about seeing Sanjana's ghost from the beginning, instead of trying to handle it alone. If he'd called the barber sooner, before the possession became so entrenched. Would any of those alternate paths have led somewhere better? Or was this outcome inevitable from the moment Sanjana's eyes refused to close on the funeral pyre, from the moment her body refused to burn, from the moment her love proved stronger than death itself? These counterfactuals are pointless, he knows. The past is fixed. Only the future remains negotiable. And the future he's building, carefully and with constant awareness of how fragile it all is, that's the only thing he can control. He can't change what happened. He can't undo the trauma or erase the scars. But he can try to protect his daughter from the worst of it. He can try to give Shruti space to heal, or at least space to exist without constantly reliving the horror. He can try to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even if that normalcy is a performance they are all consciously choosing to believe in. The house they live in now is new construction, built on land with no history. No one died here. No tragedies occurred in these rooms. It should feel clean, neutral, free from associations. But sometimes Aditya walks through these unfamiliar hallways and feels exactly the same weight he felt in the old house, the same sensation of being watched by something that exists just outside normal perception. The change of location didn't help. The problem was never the place. It was, and is, carried inside them, written into their very cells, part of who they've become. He's had to accept certain truths. That safety is an illusion. That control is temporary at best. That the universe contains spaces and forces that don't care about human desires or human suffering. That love, the thing celebrated in poetry and song, the thing that's supposed to redeem and elevate, can also corrupt and destroy. These truths sit heavy in his chest, changing how he breathes, how he moves through the world. Other people seem lighter somehow, unburdened by knowledge he can't unlearn. He envies them that lightness, even as he knows it's built on ignorance, on the luxury of never having encountered something that broke their understanding of how things work. The girl is asking questions now, old enough to notice that her family isn't quite like other families. Why do they have so many protective charms? Why does her father check her room multiple times each night? Why does her mother sometimes look at her with an expression that mingles love with something that looks almost like fear? She's too young for the truth, but old enough to sense that truth is being withheld. This creates its own problems. Children know when they are being lied to, even if they can't articulate what the lie is about. The knowledge that something is being hidden breeds anxiety, imagination running wild to fill the gaps left by absent explanation. Aditya knows he'll have to tell her eventually. Not everything, not the full horror, but enough that she understands she needs to be careful, that she needs to pay attention to certain warning signs. But how do you explain something like this to a child? How do you say, the woman whose picture hangs in the hallway, the woman everyone speaks of with sadness and respect, she might also be a threat to you? How do you balance honoring memory with acknowledging danger? These are impossible negotiations, and yet he'll have to attempt them because ignorance won't protect her. If anything, ignorance makes her more vulnerable, less prepared for what might come. He practices sometimes, late at night when everyone else is sleeping, trying out different phrasings, different approaches to the conversation. None of them sound right. They all either say too much or not enough. They all fail to capture the complexity, the way love and threat are tangled together so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. Maybe that's the real lesson, the one he needs to convey. That the world doesn't divide neatly into good and evil, safe and dangerous, friend and enemy. That the same person can be all of those things simultaneously. That the capacity for harm doesn't negate the capacity for love, and the presence of love doesn't preclude the possibility of destruction. These are adult realizations, perhaps too adult even for most adults. But his daughter won't have the luxury of coming to them gradually, naturally, through the gentle progression of experience. She'll need to understand them early, understand them deeply, because her life might depend on that understanding. It's not fair. None of this is fair, but fairness is another illusion, another comfortable fiction that only works until reality demonstrates otherwise. The barber sends letters occasionally, checking on them, offering continued protection through prayers and purified water. Aditya appreciates the gesture, even though he suspects the prayers do more for his own peace of mind than for any actual spiritual protection. The barber's original warning proved accurate. The ritual worked, but only partially. The connection persists, dormant but present, always present. And dormant doesn't mean dead. It means sleeping, and sleeping things wake. So they wait. All of them, in their different ways, wait for something they can't quite name. A resolution, a revelation, a final confrontation, or perhaps just more of the same, this endless suspended tension that's become their new normal. Waiting is its own kind of torture, but it's also familiar now, almost comfortable in its consistency. At least while they're waiting, nothing is actively going wrong. At least in the space between fears, there's room to breathe, to laugh occasionally, to pretend that life can still contain joy even when shadowed by persistent dread. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. Because the alternative, surrendering to the fear completely, letting it consume every moment and every thought, that's its own kind of possession. That's giving Sanjana power she hasn't actually claimed, letting her win without her having to do anything. So they resist. They live. They find moments of happiness in defiance of everything that suggests happiness shouldn't be possible. They love each other carefully and with full awareness of how fragile everything is, but genuinely nonetheless. The story doesn't end here because the story doesn't end at all. It continues, day after day, moment after moment, each one a small victory over the darkness that tried to consume them. There will be more incidents, more strange moments, more nights when Aditya lies awake convinced he hears anklet bells or smells that distinctive perfume. But there will also be mornings, sunlight, his daughter's laughter, Shruti's hand in his, the small, ordinary miracles that constitute a life. Even a life lived under shadow. And if Sanjano is still out there, still watching, still waiting for her opportunity, well, they're watching too. They're ready, as much as anyone can be ready for something like this. They've learned from what happened. They've prepared as best they can. They've accepted that perfect safety is impossible, but they've also learned that impossible odds don't mean automatic defeat. They survived once. They can survive again if they have to. The question is whether they'll have to, and that question hangs in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, a permanent uncertainty that's become as much a part of their lives as breathing.